The cup with the wrong saucer. The first thing Clara Hastings noticed about the room was not the books. It was the teacup placed on top of a bound volume of sermons, balanced with such domestic confidence that it seemed to belong there, though plainly it did not. The cup itself was thin white china with a faded blue rim. The saucer beneath it, however, was cream with a ring of tiny green leaves. Even to Clara, who had never in her life cared very much for china, the mismatch gave off that faintly troubled feeling one had when seeing a hymn sung to the wrong tune. It was not enough to matter. It was enough to be remembered. The parish reading room at St. Bartholomew's stood a little apart from the church, joined to it by a covered stone passage whose roof drummed softly beneath the rooks. It had been built, so Clara had been told on her first afternoon in Larkspur Hollow, by a widow with firm views about self-improvement and weak lungs. The result was a building both earnest and chilly. Tall arched windows let in a pale, sifted light. The coal stove glowed bravely in the middle of the room and failed with dignity to warm the far corners. Along the walls stood shelves of old devotional works, county histories, missionary memoirs, and several novels that looked as if they had been lent in 1912 and never claimed again. There was a smell peculiar to the place. Not simply dust, not simply paper. It was the staleness of books kept too close to damp stone over too many winters, with underneath it a ghost of furniture polish and the sharp, dry scent of old hymn sheets. Clara set down her gloves and took in the small assembly gathering for the Thursday reading hour. As a temporary visitor, she had been invited everywhere with the brisk kindness villages extended toward unmarried school teachers of respectable age and uncertain permanence. Her post in Bath did not begin until autumn. Her aunt in Winchester had gone abroad with improbable vigour. Larkspur Hollow, where an old college friend had cousins, had thus become a stopping place of 3 quiet weeks. "Now you mustn't look alarmed," said Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb, gliding toward her with a tray. "We are not improving one another by force. We only read aloud a little, and occasionally people remember things they had no intention of saying. It passes the time most usefully." She had one of those faces that villagers trusted without examination. Soft brown hair drawn back plainly, a voice low and unhurried, hands that seemed always to know where things belonged. She wore dove-grey wool and a small silver cross at her throat. Clara had already observed that Mrs. Whitcomb remembered not only names, but preferences. Mr. Ellis took less sugar now than last Lent. Colonel Brace disliked draughts, but would never ask that a window be shut. Mrs. Denby said she did not care for milk and tea, though in fact she liked a drop and forgot to request it half the time. There was comfort in such competence. "At present," Mrs. Whitcomb continued, "we are waiting for Mr. Pritchard, who never arrives late in any ordinary sense but prefers others to feel that he might. It is a professional habit left over from the law, I think." "Is he a great man in the parish?" Clara asked. Mrs. Whitcomb's smile altered by one almost invisible degree. "He was a solicitor in Alton for many years and retired here some time ago. People consult him about trusts, cottages, wills, marriages that ought not to happen, and marriages that already have. He is very useful. In villages, usefulness is often mistaken for virtue, but that is only because people dislike being inconvenienced." The remark was so mild in tone and so precise in content that Clara looked at her more closely. Mrs. Whitcomb was already turning away. At the long oak table near the stove, a little elderly lady in a pale tweed coat sat with her hands folded on a black handbag. Her white hair was tucked beneath a straw hat decorated with violets that had seen better seasons and survived them with grace. She had blue eyes of that deceptively mild kind which took in everything, and appeared to judge nothing. Clara had met her only the day before at the vicarage, where Mrs. Bantry's cousin's friend's nephew had somehow been discovered to know Clara's headmistress. "Miss Marple," said Clara, going over, "how nice to see a familiar face. That is to say, familiar to one evening's acquaintance." "My dear, one evening is often quite enough," said Miss Marple. "People can maintain an impression for years if they are careful, but for 10 minutes at tea they generally lapse into themselves. It is a great mercy to the observant and sometimes a warning to the rest of us." She glanced, not at Clara, but at the tray Mrs. Whitcomb was arranging. "How very pretty the cups are," Clara said, following her gaze. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and how extremely odd." Before Clara could ask what she meant, the door at the end of the passage opened, and a gentleman entered with the air of a man arriving not at a parish room, but at a hearing in which lesser minds had been waiting poorly. Mr. Leonard Pritchard was tall, spare, and still carried himself with the straight-backed caution of late middle age that had once been vanity and had since become discipline. His hair was silver and very neatly brushed. He wore a dark suit too formal for the occasion, and he held his gloves in one hand as though they were evidence. "I trust," he said, not greeting anyone in particular, "that we are not beginning with modern verse again. Last week's selection sounded like a private quarrel, transcribed without revision." Colonel Brace laughed more heartily than the joke deserved. Mrs. Denby looked away. The vicar, Mr. Fenton, rubbed his spectacles with unnecessary concentration. Mrs. Whitcomb poured tea. She moved without hurry, though Clara noticed that she never asked Mr. Pritchard whether he wanted sugar. She gave him one lump, precisely one, and he took the cup without thanks, which was perhaps among old acquaintances a form of acknowledgement. Then she passed cups to the others, to Clara, to Colonel Brace, to Mrs. Denby, to Mr. Fenton, to Miss Marple. Yet when the tray was empty and all were provided for, Mrs. Whitcomb set aside the last cup she had poured for herself and did not drink from it. Instead, she straightened a pamphlet, then a pile of parish notices, then the little brass key on the mantel, only to frown and say, "How tiresome! That is not the cabinet key after all. And I was certain I'd put it there." Mr. Pritchard looked up at once. "The records cabinet ought not to stand unlocked," he said. "One would imagine that after the confusion over the Fairchild burial entries, greater care would be taken." His tone was even, but the room altered. Only a little. Only enough for Clara to feel that a foot had been placed lightly upon some hidden board beneath them all. Mr. Fenton gave an embarrassed cough. "The matter was settled, Leonard. We need not keep dragging poor old names into daylight. My dear Fenton, daylight is exactly where records belong. That is the point of records." Miss Marple, cupping her tea, looked not at the speaker, but at Mrs. Whitcomb's untouched cup. "I remember," she said conversationally, "a woman in St. Mary Mead who kept the church rummage ledger in a drawer beneath lavender bags." Miss Hartnell thought it was tidiness, but it was really conscious. She had sold the best shawl to her own sister for 3p before the sale opened, and every time anyone asked for the account she developed a trembling hand. It was very sad because the shawl did not suit her sister at all. There was a ripple of amusement. Even Mr. Pritchard smiled thinly, as if tolerating quaintness on sufferance. "But ledgers do unsettle people," Miss Marple went on, warming to her theme in the mild, wandering way Clara was beginning to suspect was not wandering at all. "Lists of what happened, and when, and to whom, they look so harmless. Only little lines of ink, yet they can be terribly persistent, much more so than memory, and far less forgiving." Mrs. Denby gave a small restless laugh and reached for a biscuit she did not eat. "You make parish books sound positively murderous, Miss Marple." "Oh, I should never accuse a parish book of anything deliberate," said Miss Marple. "Still, one has seen trouble come from smaller causes. There was a mason's daughter in St. Mary Mead who altered the date in her Bible because she was engaged in rather a hurry. It was done very neatly, but unfortunately she forgot that flies leave marks according to the season, and one cannot have a June fly crushed into a page that was supposedly last touched in February." Clara laughed, then stopped because no one else really had. Mr. Pritchard had set down his cup. He was looking at the locked glass cabinet at the far end of the room. Its panes reflected the arched windows in strips of pale light. Behind them were tied bundles of papers, old registers, vestry books with cracked leather backs, and a red dispatch box whose brass corners had gone green. "I think," he said slowly, "that before another week has passed, a number of things ought to be put in order." His voice was not raised. It did not need to be. Mrs. Whitcomb stood perfectly still beside the tea tray, one hand on the handle of the pot. Clara saw, with a sharpness she could not explain, that the woman's knuckles had whitened. Then Mrs. Whitcomb smiled. "Order," she said gently, "is a Christian ambition, Mr. Pritchard, but a dangerous one in small rooms. If one straightens every shelf, all sorts of forgotten things tumble out." No one answered at once. Outside, a rook landed hard on the roof, and the sound ran over the slates like a hand brushing pebbles. Miss Marple took the smallest possible sip of tea. Clara did not know it then, but years later she would remember that moment exactly as it had stood before her, the wrong saucer, the untouched cup, the locked cabinet, and Leonard Pritchard looking like a man who had already decided that silence at last had gone on long enough. What the room remembered. Clara found, on her second visit to the reading room, that it was not the people who changed the atmosphere of the place, but their arrangements. Chairs had been shifted, only slightly, yet enough to disturb the quiet geometry she had unconsciously mapped the day before. The long oak table had been moved closer to the stove, as though warmth might persuade conversation into safer channels. The mismatched teacups were set out again, though not quite in the same order. Then Clara noticed that the blue-rimmed cup now stood beside a plain white saucer, which seemed an attempt at correction that only made the earlier error more present. It struck her, not for the first time, that rooms remembered, not as people did, with feeling or intention, but through small resistances, objects that did not settle back quite as expected, shadows that held the shape of yesterday's movement. Miss Marple was already seated when Clara arrived, her gloved hands folded on her handbag as before. She looked as though she had been there for hours, quietly absorbing the place in the manner of someone listening to a conversation conducted at a distance. "My dear Miss Hastings," she said as Clara approached, You see how everything is very nearly as it was, and yet not quite. It is so often the case. People imagine that if one alters a detail, one has altered the whole. But the mind, like a careful housemaid, notices what has been disturbed and keeps a little note of it. Clara smiled. You make it sound as though the room itself were keeping accounts. Yes, said Miss Marple, and rather better accounts than some people, I am afraid. Mrs. Whitcomb entered from the vestry corridor carrying a small stack of pamphlets. She greeted Clara with the same gentle warmth as before, though there was a faint tightness about her eyes, as if she had not slept quite as soundly as she might have wished. You are punctual, she said. It is always a relief. One never knows, in a village, whether punctuality is a habit or a declaration. Clara laughed. I assure you, in my case, it is only a habit. Habits are declarations. If one looks long enough, Mrs. Whitcomb replied, placing the pamphlets in a neat row. They tell us what we rely upon when we are not thinking. She moved toward the mantel and lifted the small brass key, turning it over once in her fingers. Then, with a faint frown, she set it down again. I am still unable to locate the cabinet key, she said. It is most inconvenient, as Mr. Pritchard reminded us yesterday. At the mention of his name, Clara felt that same slight shift in the room, the invisible tightening of something that had not yet snapped. Has he been in today? Clara asked. Mrs. Whitcomb hesitated, just long enough for the pause to be noticed, then smiled. He called this morning, only briefly. He wished to confirm that the records would be available for inspection before Sunday. I explained that we were still searching. He seemed determined. Miss Marple's gaze rested lightly on Mrs. Whitcomb's hands. Determination is such a curious quality, she said. It can look like strength from the outside and feel like desperation from within. I remember a gentleman in St. Mary Mead, Mr. Caleb Simmons, who insisted on repainting his entire house every spring. Everyone admired his energy. It was only later that we understood he was covering something quite dreadful on the walls. Not dirt, you understand. Something that would not come away with soap and water. Clara felt a faint prickle of unease, though Miss Marple's tone remained as mild as ever. What happened? She asked. Oh, nothing very dramatic, Miss Marple replied. The truth came out, as it does, though not always in the way one expects. The house was never quite the same afterward, and neither was Mr. Simmons. It is a pity, because he had been very particular about his roses. Mrs. Whitcomb busied herself with the tea things, though Clara noticed that she had not yet lit the stove. The room held a chill that seemed to settle in the corners and watch. When the others arrived, Colonel Brace with his hearty voice, Mrs. Denby with her careful politeness, Mr. Fenton with his mild distraction, the conversation began as it had before, with small observations and gentle disagreements that never quite reached their point. It was Mr. Pritchard's absence that made itself felt. He is late, said Colonel Brace, glancing at the door, which is unlike him. I say, Whitcomb, you don't suppose he has taken offence at something said yesterday? Mrs. Whitcomb poured tea with steady hands. I should not like to think so, she said, though one never knows what small remark may linger with someone. Words are like seeds. They do not always grow where they are planted. Miss Marple accepted her cup and held it without drinking. Seeds, she murmured, are very patient. They can wait a long time for the right conditions. Clara noticed again that Mrs. Whitcomb had poured a cup for herself and set it aside untouched. It was such a small thing, yet it repeated itself. Perhaps he's unwell, Mrs. Denby suggested. Reaching for a biscuit, she turned over twice before setting it down again. At his age, one cannot be too careful. Leonard is not the sort to be unwell quietly, said Mr. Fenton. He would have sent word, if only to ensure that we understood the seriousness of the matter. There was a faint attempt at humour in his tone, but it did not quite succeed. Clara found her attention drifting to the locked cabinet. The glass panes reflected the movement of the room in broken fragments. Hands lifting cups, heads turning, the flicker of the unlit stove catching what little light there was. May I ask, she said, what exactly is kept in there, beyond the obvious? Mr. Fenton cleared his throat. Parish records, primarily. Baptisms, marriages, burials, some older documents relating to land and endowments. Nothing of immediate interest to anyone outside the village. On the contrary, said Miss Marple softly, such things are often of the greatest interest, particularly when they concern what people would prefer to forget. Mrs. Whitcomb's hand paused on the teapot. It is only history, she said, and history, as we all know, is written by those who survive to tell it. Miss Marple looked at her with gentle curiosity. Yes, she said, though sometimes it is also written by those who are very anxious that certain parts should not be read too closely. The door opened then, with a suddenness that made Clara start. A boy stood on the threshold, his cap in his hands, his face flushed from running. Mrs. Whitcomb, he said, his voice catching slightly, there's been a bit of trouble. What sort of trouble? Mrs. Whitcomb asked, setting down the teapot with deliberate care. It's Mr. Pritchard, the boy said. He's at home, and Mrs. Kersey sent me. She says he's not working properly, and the doctor's been called. The room seemed to draw in upon itself. "Not working properly," Mr. Fenton repeated. "What does that mean?" The boy shifted from one foot to the other. "He's breathing, sir, but he won't answer. Not like himself at all." Mrs. Whitcomb had gone very still. "Thank you," she said. "You may tell Mrs. Kersey that we will come at once." The boy nodded and vanished as quickly as he had appeared. For a moment no one spoke. Then Colonel Brace rose abruptly. "Well, we must go, of course. Can't leave the man unattended in such a state." Mrs. Denby gathered her things with trembling hands. Mr. Fenton reached for his coat. Clara stood, her heart beating faster than seemed reasonable. Miss Marple remained seated. "My dear," she said quietly to Clara, "you will find that what people do in such moments is often more revealing than what they say afterward. It is a pity, but also a convenience." Clara looked at her, uncertain. "Aren't you coming?" she asked. "In a moment," Miss Marple replied. "I think I should finish my tea." She lifted the cup and took a small, thoughtful sip. Across the room, Mrs. Whitcomb stood beside the untouched cup she had poured for herself. She did not drink from it. And Clara, watching her, felt with sudden clarity that something had already begun, something that would not be undone by whatever they were about to find at Mr. Pritchard's house. The house that kept its curtains drawn. Clara had expected Mr. Leonard Pritchard's house to resemble the man, ordered, precise, perhaps faintly austere. What she had not expected was the stillness. The curtains were drawn, though it was not yet evening, and the narrow hall smelled faintly of furniture polish and something else beneath it, something medicinal, but not fresh. It was the kind of smell that lingered after being used repeatedly over time, rather than all at once. Mrs. Kersey, a broad-shouldered woman with flour still dusted along the sleeve of her dress, met them at the door. "I'm glad you've come," she said, lowering her voice without quite knowing why. "He's upstairs. Doctor's with him now, though he doesn't seem much inclined to say what he thinks, which is never a comfort, if you ask me." Colonel Brace stepped forward at once. "Well then, we shall see what can be done," he said, though his tone suggested he did not expect to do very much at all. Clara followed the others into the sitting-room, where the air felt warmer but no less heavy. A fire had been lit, though it burned low and unevenly, as if neglected in the tending. Papers lay on a small writing desk near the window, neatly stacked, but with one sheet placed slightly askew, as though it had been interrupted mid-reading. She moved closer without thinking. It was not a letter, not quite, more a list, names, dates, and brief annotations written in a careful, controlled hand. Some of the names had been underlined, others bore small marks beside them, like ticks or crosses, though not in any pattern Clara could immediately understand. "Miss Hastings," said Miss Marple's voice gently behind her, "one finds that lists are often more revealing than letters. Letters are written to be read. Lists are written to be remembered." Clara turned. Miss Marple had come in quietly, her eyes moving over the room not with curiosity, but with a kind of quiet recognition. "You think this is important?" Clara asked softly. "I think it is honest," Miss Marple replied. "And honesty, when it appears uninvited, is always worth noticing." Upstairs there was the sound of movement, footsteps, then the murmur of voices. Mrs. Kersey hovered near the doorway. "He was fine yesterday," she said, as though repeating it might make it more solid. "Sat right there, he did, and told me the tea was too weak, same as always. There wasn't anything wrong with him that I could see." "Did he eat?" Clara asked. "Oh yes, miss, he always eats. Regular as the clock he is. Soup at midday, something proper in the evening. Though," she hesitated, then shook her head. "It doesn't seem like that sort of thing, does it?" Miss Marple's gaze rested briefly on the mantel, where a row of small pill bottles stood in careful alignment. "Regular habits," she said softly, "are very reassuring. They allow a great many changes to go unnoticed." Before Clara could ask what she meant, the doctor descended the stairs. He was a thin man with a tired expression, and hands that seemed accustomed to being doubted. "Well," he said, glancing at the assembled group, "he is alive, which is something, but I would not like to say much beyond that at present." "What has happened to him?" Mr. Fenton asked, his voice strained. The doctor removed his spectacles and rubbed them with a handkerchief. "It is difficult to be certain. His pulse is irregular, his breathing shallow. There is no sign of injury. It could be the heart, though it does not present in the usual way." Colonel Brace frowned. "Then what do you suggest?" "I suggest," the doctor replied carefully, "that we wait. I've given him something to steady him. If there is any change—" "And if there is not?" Mrs. Denby asked, her hands clasped tightly together. The doctor replaced his spectacles. "Then we shall know more by morning." There was something in his tone that made Clara feel that knowing more might not be a comfort. Mrs. Whitcomb had said nothing since their arrival. She stood near the window, her hands folded before her, her expression composed, yet Clara noticed that her gaze did not rest on any one thing. It moved, lightly and continuously, as though seeking something it could not quite find. "May we see him?" she asked at last. The doctor hesitated, then inclined his head. "Briefly. One at a time, perhaps. He is not conscious, but, well, sometimes people hear more than we think." Colonel Brace went first, followed by Mr. Fenton. When Clara's turn came, she climbed the narrow staircase with a curious sense of trespassing. The bedroom was smaller than she had expected. The bed was neatly made, though the coverlet had been drawn back. Mr. Pritchard lay upon it, his face pale against the white pillow, his features set in a way that suggested not rest, but effort. It was the effort that struck her, as though even now, in whatever state he was still holding something in place. She stood for a moment, uncertain. "I did not know you well," she said quietly, feeling faintly foolish, "but it seems to me that you were not a man who liked to leave things unfinished." There was no response, of course, yet as she turned to go, she thought, only for an instant, that his hand had moved. Downstairs again, she found Miss Marple standing near the writing desk. "My dear," Miss Marple said. "Did you notice anything in particular?" Clara hesitated. "He looked as though he were trying to hold on," she said at last. "As though there was something he had not yet done." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, that is often the case. People do not like to leave matters unresolved. It is a very human failing." She glanced at the list on the desk. "And sometimes," she added, "it is a very dangerous one." Mrs. Whitcomb moved toward the door. "I think," she said gently, "that we should leave him to rest. There is nothing more we can do here tonight." The others murmured agreement. As they stepped out into the fading light, Clara felt the air shift again, cooler now, sharper, as though the village itself had taken a breath. Miss Marple walked beside her, her pace unhurried. "I once knew a man in St. Mary Mead," she said, "who kept a list very like the one we saw just now. Names, dates, little marks that meant everything to him, and nothing to anyone else. He believed he was setting things right, you see, putting the past in order." "And was he?" Clara asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, the past is never put in order. It only waits for someone to look at it closely enough." Clara glanced back at the house, its curtains still drawn, its windows reflecting the last light of the day. "And when someone does?" she asked. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. "Then," she said, "one must be prepared for what comes of it." They walked on in silence. Behind them, in the quiet house, Leonard Pritchard lay between what had been and what might yet be said, and somewhere in that narrow space between the two something had already begun to take shape. A very reasonable explanation. Clara returned to the reading room the following morning with the peculiar sense that she was arriving not at a place, but at a continuation. The room looked precisely as it ought. Chairs aligned, books undisturbed. The coal stove lit early, so that the faint chill had been softened into something almost hospitable. Even the teacups had been arranged with a certain careful symmetry, as though yesterday's small irregularities had been quietly corrected. Yet the correction itself was noticeable. The blue-rimmed cup and the cream saucer with green leaves now sat separately, placed at opposite ends of the tray as though they had never met. It was, Clara thought, an overcorrection, the kind one made when one wished very much for something not to be remarked upon again. Miss Marple was already present, as before, her hat placed neatly beside her, her attention apparently given to a small volume she held open in her lap. Clara suspected, however, that she had read no more than a page. "My dear Miss Hastings," she said, without looking up, "you see how very determined everything is to appear ordinary today. It is quite touching, really." Clara smiled faintly. "I suppose it is natural," she said, "after what happened yesterday." "Natural, yes," Miss Marple replied, "but one must always be cautious of what is natural. It so often conceals intention." Mrs. Whitcomb entered then, carrying a fresh pot of tea. She looked composed, more than composed, in fact, settled, as though she had come to a conclusion during the night and now intended to live by it. Her movements were as precise as ever, her voice as gentle. Yet there was a firmness beneath it that Clara had not noticed before. "I hope you slept well," she said to Clara, setting down the tray. "It is remarkable how quickly one grows accustomed to village quiet. At first it seems empty. Then one realizes it is simply unoccupied." "I slept very well, thank you," Clara replied. "And Mr. Pritchard, have you had any news?" Mrs. Whitcomb's hands did not falter, though Clara saw the slightest tightening at her wrist as she lifted the teapot. "The doctor visited again this morning," she said. "There has been no significant change. He remains as he was." "Unconscious?" Clara asked. "Yes, though breathing steadily, which is something." Miss Marple accepted her cup and turned it slightly before setting it down. "It is indeed something," she said, "though one sometimes finds that steadiness can be misleading. I remember a woman in St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Calthrop knew her well, who appeared quite calm after a most distressing event. Everyone admired her composure. It was only later that we realized she had simply decided not to feel anything until it was too late to do so." Clara glanced at Mrs. Whitcomb, who smiled faintly. "That sounds rather exhausting," she said. "It can be," Miss Marple agreed, "but it is also very efficient. One gets through a great deal that way." Colonel Brace arrived shortly afterward, bringing with him a gust of outdoor air and a voice that filled the room more than necessary. "Any news?" he asked at once, removing his gloves. "I stopped by Pritchard's on my way here, but Kersey said the doctor had only just left." Mrs. Whitcomb repeated what she had already said, her tone unchanged. "Well," the colonel said, "these things happen. Man of his age, after all. One cannot expect the machinery to go on indefinitely." There was a murmur of agreement, though it seemed to Clara that it came more from habit than conviction. Mr. Fenton entered more quietly, his expression troubled. "I have been thinking," he said, taking a seat near the stove, "about what Leonard said yesterday, about the records. He seemed very intent upon them." Mrs. Whitcomb poured him tea. "Yes," she said, "he did. I wonder," Mr. Fenton continued, "whether there is anything in particular he wished to address, something we may have overlooked." Mrs. Whitcomb set down the teapot with deliberate care. "I cannot imagine what that might be," she said. "The records are in order, as far as I am aware. There was a small confusion over the Fairchild entries, of course, but that was resolved some time ago." Miss Marple looked up. "Resolved," she repeated gently. "That is such a comforting word. It suggests that everything has been put neatly away, though one does sometimes find that what is resolved on paper is not quite so resolved in people." Mrs. Denby, who had entered unnoticed and now sat twisting her handkerchief, gave a small, nervous laugh. "You make it sound as though the records themselves might disagree with us," she said. "Oh, they often do," Miss Marple replied. "Not in any active sense, of course, but they remain, and in remaining, they have a way of contradicting whatever story one has grown used to telling." Clara found her attention drawn again to the mantel. The small brass key was there. It had not been there the day before. "Oh," she said without thinking, "you found it." Mrs. Whitcomb followed her gaze. "Yes," she said. "It was in the vestry of all places. I must have misplaced it during the cleaning. It is most unfortunate how easily such things happen." Her tone was perfectly reasonable. Too reasonable, Clara thought suddenly. Miss Marple rose and moved toward the cabinet. "May I?" she asked. "Of course," Mrs. Whitcomb replied, though Clara noticed that she did not step aside immediately. Miss Marple waited, not impatiently, simply waiting, as though time itself were part of the conversation. After a moment, Mrs. Whitcomb shifted. Miss Marple took the key and unlocked the cabinet. The glass door opened with a soft, reluctant sound. Inside, the bundles of records stood as Clara remembered them, tied with string, labelled in careful script, arranged in what appeared to be a system only someone very familiar with them would fully understand. Miss Marple reached for one of the older volumes. "This must be quite a responsibility," she said, "to keep so many histories in one place, so many beginnings and endings all written down." "It is a duty," Mrs. Whitcomb said, "and one I take seriously." "I am sure you do," Miss Marple replied. She opened the volume and turned a page. Clara could not see what she was looking at, but she saw the way Miss Marple's expression altered, not in surprise, exactly, but in recognition. "Ah," she said softly. "Yes, that is very interesting." "What is?" Colonel Brace asked, leaning forward. Miss Marple closed the book. "Oh, nothing of immediate importance," she said. "Only a small inconsistency. The sort of thing that occurs quite naturally over time." Mrs. Whitcomb's hands were very still. "I should be grateful," she said, "if you would point it out to me later. I do not like to leave things uncorrected." Miss Marple smiled. "My dear Mrs. Whitcomb, I am quite certain you do not." She returned the book to its place and closed the cabinet. Clara felt a faint unease settle over her, though she could not have said why. Everything had been explained. The key had been found. The records were in order. Mr. Pritchard's condition was unfortunate but not inexplicable. It was all very reasonable. And yet, as Mrs. Whitcomb moved once more among the cups, pouring tea with her usual care, Clara noticed that she had again poured a cup for herself, and again she did not drink it. Miss Marple lifted her own cup and took a small sip. "Reasonable explanations," she said lightly, "are often the most dangerous kind. They fit so comfortably that one does not think to question them." Clara looked at her. "You think there is something to question?" Miss Marple met her gaze, her blue eyes mild and thoughtful. "My dear," she said, "there is always something to question. The difficulty lies in knowing which questions one is willing to hear the answers to." Across the room, Mrs. Whitcomb stood beside the untouched cup, her expression serene, but her eyes had not settled, and Clara, watching her, felt again that quiet, insistent sense that whatever had begun the day before had not paused, but merely adjusted itself, waiting, as Miss Marple might say, for the right conditions to grow. What solicitors know, and when Clara did not expect to be invited into Mr. Pritchard's house again so soon. Yet by late afternoon, a note had arrived, delivered not by the boy from before, but by Mrs. Kersey herself, who stood at the gate with a firmness that suggested refusal would be both inconvenient and unkind. "If you've a mind to come," she said, "the doctor's asking questions now, and it seems there's things that might be clearer to someone as was there yesterday. I don't say I understand it, but I don't like the feel of it either. Clara found herself agreeing before she had properly considered why. Miss Marple, when told, did not express surprise. "My dear, one is always sent for when people begin to feel uncertain," she said, adjusting her gloves. "It is not that one knows more than others, though occasionally one does, but that one notices what they have already seen and not quite understood." "Oh, that is often enough." They walked together, the narrow lane giving off the faint green smell of crushed grass where wheels had passed. The hedges leaned inward, as though to listen. "I have been thinking," Clara said, "about Mr. Pritchard's list, the one on his desk. It did not look like ordinary notes." "No," Miss Marple replied, "it did not. What do you suppose it was?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Lists, my dear, are seldom what they appear to be. They are not only records, they are intentions. One writes down what one means to remember, and sometimes what one means to do." Clara felt a small, uneasy shift in her thoughts. "You think he intended to act on it?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that he had already begun." Mrs. Kersey admitted them at once, her expression tight. "The doctor's upstairs," she said. "And there's a gentleman come from Alton, Mr. Pritchard's former clerk, or something of the sort. He's been going through papers which I don't much care for, but he says it's necessary." The sitting room had changed, not in its arrangement, but in its feeling. The air seemed thinner, as though something that had held it in place had loosened. The writing desk stood open now, its contents partially disturbed. Several sheets lay spread out, and the list Clara had seen the day before was no longer alone. A man stood beside the desk, his back to them. He turned as they entered. "I beg your pardon," he said, with a slight inclination of the head. "I did not hear you come in." He was younger than Clara had expected, perhaps in his early 40s, fair with a careful manner and a face that suggested he had spent many years observing rather than speaking. "Mr. Harding," Mrs. Kersey said. "From Alton." He nodded. "I worked with Mr. Pritchard for nearly 20 years, he said. "I thought it best to come at once when I heard." Clara introduced herself, and Miss Marple followed with her usual gentle precision. "Such loyalty is a great comfort," Miss Marple said, "particularly in moments of uncertainty. One always hopes that those who know us best will also understand what we have left undone." Mr. Harding's expression flickered, though he recovered quickly. "Yes," he said, "there are matters here that may require attention." He gestured toward the papers. "I hope you will forgive my intrusion," he added, "but I believe Mr. Pritchard was in the process of reviewing certain parish documents. It seems he had concerns." Clara stepped closer to the desk. The list was still there, but it had been joined by other pages, copies of entries, notes in the margins, small annotations that linked one name to another in ways that were not immediately clear. "What sort of concerns?" she asked. Mr. Harding hesitated. "It is not my place to speculate," he said, "but I can say that Mr. Pritchard was not a man to involve himself lightly. If he began to examine something, it was because he believed it mattered." Miss Marple moved to stand beside the desk. "Yes," she said softly, "and because he believed it could be proved." Mr. Harding looked at her with a hint of curiosity. "I suppose that is true," he said. Clara's eyes moved over the names. Some she recognized from the reading room, others from casual mention in the village. The dates stretched back decades. Small notes had been added beside certain entries, changes, corrections, questions. "Were there errors?" she asked. "In records of that age there are always errors," Mr. Harding replied. "But these," he paused, "these are not the sort that occur by accident." Clara felt her breath catch slightly. "You mean they were altered deliberately?" Mr. Harding did not answer at once. "I mean," he said carefully, "that Mr. Pritchard believed they were." Miss Marple's gaze rested on the list. "And did he say why?" she asked. "No," Mr. Harding said, "not directly, but he asked me some weeks ago about a particular set of entries. He seemed troubled by them." "Which entries?" Clara asked. Mr. Harding reached for one of the papers. "The Fairchild records," he said. "There was a discrepancy in the burial register. A date that did not align with other documents. At the time, it seemed a minor matter. And now?" Miss Marple prompted. Mr. Harding looked at her. "Now I am not so certain." There was a sound from upstairs, a movement, then the faint murmur of the doctor's voice. Mrs. Kersey shifted uneasily. "I don't like it," she said. "All this looking and writing. It doesn't feel right. Not with him lying there as he is." Miss Marple turned to her. "My dear Mrs. Kersey," she said gently, "it is precisely because he is lying there that these things must be looked at. When a man can no longer speak for himself, what he has written becomes his voice." Clara felt a sudden clarity. "He was trying to say something," she said. "Yesterday, in the reading room." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and I think he believed he had very little time in which to say it." Mr. Harding looked between them. "You think his condition is connected to this?" he asked. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached for one of the pages and turned it slightly, aligning it with the others. "I think," she said at last, that when a man who has lived by order and evidence begins to make a list such as this, it is because he has come to understand something that cannot easily be ignored. Clara glanced again at the names. And someone else understood it too, she said. Miss Marple met her gaze. Yes, she said, and was not willing to have it spoken aloud. There was a silence then, filled not with absence but with the weight of what had not yet been said. Mr. Harding drew a slow breath. If that is so, he said, then we must consider. He stopped. From upstairs came a sudden sharp sound. Not a voice. Not quite. More the sound of something being moved, abruptly, without care. Mrs. Kersey turned toward the stairs. I'll see what that is, she said, and hurried out. Clara felt her pulse quicken. Miss Marple remained where she was, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the desk. My dear, she said quietly to Clara, you see how the matter begins to arrange itself. Not neatly, of course. It never is, but sufficiently for one to begin asking the right questions. Clara nodded. And the answers? She asked. Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. The answers, she said, are already here. It is only a question of whether we are willing to recognize them. Upstairs the sound came again, and this time it was unmistakably a voice. Everything that was not said. The sound from upstairs did not resemble speech in any ordinary sense. It was strained, uneven, like something forced through a body that no longer obeyed it properly. Clara felt it before she understood it, a tightening across her shoulders that seemed to pull her toward the staircase without quite allowing her to move. Mrs. Kersey's voice followed, sharper now. Doctor! He's trying to say something. Come quick! Mr. Harding stepped forward at once, though he stopped short of the stairs, as if uncertain of his place at the moment. Should we? He began. Miss Marple shook her head gently. Too many people rarely improve clarity, she said. We shall hear what is meant in due course. Her tone was calm, but Clara noticed that she had moved slightly closer to the base of the stairs, positioning herself not as an observer removed, but as one prepared to receive whatever came next. The house seemed to listen. Footsteps moved overhead, quick, purposeful, then slowing. The doctor's voice, low and firm. Mrs. Kersey again, now hushed, as though afraid of disturbing something fragile and fleeting. Clara realized she was holding her breath. After a moment the sound shifted. A chair scraped. Then silence. Not the absence of sound, but the kind that settles after effort, when whatever could be done has already been attempted. The doctor descended first. His expression had altered, not in any dramatic way, but in the small, unmistakable manner of someone who has crossed from uncertainty into knowledge. Well? Colonel Brace asked, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. The doctor paused at the foot of the stairs. He regained consciousness briefly, he said. Only for a moment, not enough to form proper speech. Kersey came down behind him, her apron twisted in her hands. He was trying, she said. I could see it, his lips moving like that, but it wouldn't come right. Miss Marple inclined her head. Did he respond to anything? She asked. The doctor considered. He reacted when I asked if he was in pain, and again when I mentioned the reading room. There was a degree of agitation. Clara felt a small, sharp jolt. The reading room, she repeated. Yes, the doctor said, though I cannot say what he intended. It was not clear. Mrs. Kersey shook her head. He looked as though he wanted to say something, she said. Proper desperate, he did, like a man trying to catch hold of something slipping away. Miss Marple's gaze rested on the staircase. Yes, she said softly. That is often how truth behaves at the end, just out of reach. Unless one has been holding it all along. Mr. Harding stepped forward. Did he say any words at all? He asked. The doctor hesitated. Not words, he said, but there was a sound, repeated. I could not make sense of it. What sort of sound? Clara asked. The doctor frowned slightly as if replaying it in his mind. A single syllable, he said, drawn out. It might have been a name, or simply an effort to speak. Miss Marple's eyes moved briefly toward the writing desk. And no one could interpret it? She asked. No, the doctor replied. It was too indistinct. Mrs. Kersey gave a small, frustrated sound. It meant something, she said. You could see that plain enough, but what good is the meaning if it doesn't come clear? Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear Mrs. Kersey, meaning has a way of making itself clear. Even when the words fail, one only has to notice what surrounds it. Clara felt a stirring of thought not yet formed. The reading room, she said slowly. He reacted to that, and the list, and the records. Mr. Harding looked at her. Yes, he said. That seems to be the thread. Miss Marple moved back toward the desk. Threads are very useful, she said. They lead one through what would otherwise be a most confusing pattern. She picked up the list again. Her fingers lit upon the paper. These names, she said, are not arranged alphabetically, nor by date. There is a sequence here, but it is not immediately obvious. Clara stepped closer. I noticed that, she said. Some are underlined, others marked. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, and one must always ask why certain things are emphasized while others are left plain. So it is rather like conversation. What is not said often matters more than what is. She turned one of the pages slightly. Mr. Harding, she said, did Mr. Pritchard ever mention any particular individual in connection with these records? Mr. Harding shook his head. Not directly. He was always careful in that respect, but he did say once that the truth of a matter is rarely contained in a single entry. One must look at what surrounds it. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, that is very much the case. Clara glanced toward the mantel. The small brass key lay there still, catching the light. It had been found, explained, returned, everything in its place. And yet, Miss Marple, she said, yesterday you mentioned something about a discrepancy in the records. Did you see what it was? Miss Marple smiled gently. My dear, I saw that there was one, which is not quite the same thing as understanding it. That comes a little later. Clara felt a flicker of impatience. But if Mr. Pritchard believed something was wrong, if he was trying to say it, shouldn't we? She stopped. Miss Marple was looking at her with quiet kindness. One must not rush ahead of the truth, she said. It has its own pace. If one pushes too hard, one risks missing the very thing one seeks. Clara drew a breath. I see. Do you? Miss Marple asked softly. That is most encouraging. There was a movement at the doorway. Mrs. Whitcomb stood there. Clara had not heard her enter. She looked as she always did, composed, attentive, her hands lightly folded. Yet there was something different now, something Clara could not immediately name. I thought I might find you here, she said. I went to the reading room, but it seemed empty. Her gaze moved to the desk, to the papers spread upon it. Mr. Harding, she said, with a small inclination of her head. I understand you have been assisting. He nodded. Only reviewing what was already in progress, he said. Mr. Pritchard has begun something that may require completion. Mrs. Whitcomb's expression did not change. Yes, she said. He had a way of beginning things that others felt obliged to finish. Miss Marple looked at her. And do you feel obliged, Mrs. Whitcomb? She asked. There was the slightest pause. I feel responsible, Mrs. Whitcomb replied. For the records, for their accuracy. That is my role. Of course, Miss Marple said. Roles are very important. They tell us what we must do, even when we might prefer otherwise. Clara noticed that Mrs. Whitcomb's gaze had settled on the list. May I? She asked. Miss Marple stepped aside. By all means. Mrs. Whitcomb took the paper and looked at it for a moment. Then she set it down again. It is nothing, she said. A collection of minor inconsistencies, the sort that accumulates over time. Mr. Pritchard had a tendency to see patterns where none existed. Her tone was calm, reasonable. Clara felt that same unease as before. Do you believe that? She asked. Mrs. Whitcomb met her gaze. I believe, she said, that not everything requires explanation. Some things are best left as they are. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Yes, she said. That is often said, particularly when explanations become inconvenient. Mrs. Whitcomb's hands tightened just for a moment. Then she smiled. I suppose, she said. That depends on one's perspective. Miss Marple returned the smile. Indeed it does. There was a pause, not empty, but filled with the weight of what remained unspoken. Clara felt it pressing in on her, as though the room itself were holding its breath. Upstairs, Mr. Pritchard lay between silence and speech. Downstairs, the truth moved quietly among them, waiting not to be discovered, but to be recognised. And Clara, standing between Miss Marple and Mrs. Whitcomb, understood with sudden clarity that whatever Mr. Pritchard had tried to say, it had already been heard, just not yet acknowledged. The woman who poured. Too carefully, Clara began, by the following morning, to notice how often people spoke of ordinary things with unnecessary care. It was not the words themselves. It was the way they were arranged, as though each sentence had been gently adjusted before being allowed into the open. A detail omitted here, a tone softened there, nothing one could point to, everything one could feel. The reading room was fuller than usual. Word had passed, as it always did in villages, with that curious combination of speed and discretion that allowed everyone to know and no one to admit how. Mr. Pritchard's condition had become a subject of quiet concern, not alarm precisely, not yet, but concern that hovered at the edges of conversation, appearing briefly before being replaced by safer topics. Clara took her seat beside Miss Marple, who appeared to be examining the stitching of her glove with great interest. My dear, Miss Marple said softly without looking up, you will observe that everyone is behaving most reasonably this morning. It is the most instructive state. Clara followed her gaze. Mrs. Denby was discussing the vicarage roses with an attention that seemed almost determined. Colonel Brace spoke at length about the weather, in a tone that suggested he would prefer to be speaking of something else entirely. Mr. Fenton nodded more than he spoke, which in itself was unusual, and Mrs. Whitcomb, Clara watched her. She moved among the group with her usual grace, her voice calm, her manner attentive, yet there was a precision to her actions that had sharpened overnight. She poured tea not only carefully but deliberately, measuring each movement as though it mattered more than it ought. and once again, when she poured a cup for herself, she did not drink from it. "Miss Marple," Clara murmured. "Why does she do that?" Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward Mrs. Whitcomb, then back again. "My dear, habits are rarely meaningless, particularly when they repeat themselves in moments of strain. One finds that people reveal themselves most clearly in what they do not notice they are doing." Clara considered this. "You think she does notice," she said slowly, "but choose not to drink." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think she notices everything. The question is not whether she sees, but what she permits herself to acknowledge." Before Clara could respond, Mrs. Whitcomb approached them. "I hope you're comfortable," she said. "The room can be rather temperamental in the mornings. It never quite decides whether it wishes to be warm." "It is quite pleasant," Clara replied, "though I imagine it reminds me of the colder days." Mrs. Whitcomb's smile lingered. "Rooms do have a way of remembering," she said, "though one hopes they are not too particular about it." Miss Marple looked up at her. "Particularity," she said, "is a form of honesty. It records what happens without much regard for whether it is convenient." Mrs. Whitcomb inclined her head slightly. "That may be so," she said, "but not all honesty is useful." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied gently, "it is always useful. It is simply not always welcome." There was a small pause, filled not with silence, but with awareness. Then Colonel Brace cleared his throat. "I say," he began, "has there been any further word from the doctor? About Pritchard, I mean." Mrs. Whitcomb turned to him. "No significant change," she said. "He remains as he was." "That is unfortunate," the Colonel said, with a firmness that suggested he did not know what else to say. "Still, these things take time." "Yes," Mrs. Whitcomb replied, "they do." Clara noticed that her hand had tightened slightly on the handle of the teapot. Mr. Harding entered at that moment, his expression thoughtful. "I hope I am not intruding," he said. "I wish to speak with Mr. Fenton about the records." Mr. Fenton rose at once. "Of course," he said, "though I am not certain what more there is to say." "There may be more than we realise," Mr. Harding replied. Miss Marple watched the exchange with quiet interest. "Yes," she said softly, "there very often is." Clara felt the tension in the room shift, not outwardly, but in the way attention gathered. "What have you found?" Colonel Brace asked. Mr. Harding hesitated. "It is not so much what I have found," he said, "as what I have begun to understand. The discrepancies in the records are not isolated. They form a pattern." Mrs. Denby gave a small, uncertain laugh. "A pattern of errors, you mean?" Mr. Harding shook his head. "No," he said, "a pattern of intention." The words settled into the room with quiet weight. Mrs. Whitcomb set down the teapot. "I think," she said gently, "that we must be careful not to read too much into what may simply be the result of time. Records of that age are bound to contain inconsistencies." Miss Marple looked at her. "Yes," she said, "but inconsistencies of a particular kind are rather more interesting than others, especially when they appear in relation to the same names." Clara felt her attention sharpen. "The Fairchild records," she said. "That was where it began, wasn't it?" Mr. Harding nodded. "Yes. But it does not end there. There are other entries connected, though not obviously so. Dates that shift, names that appear where they should not, and disappear where they ought to remain." Mrs. Whitcomb's expression remained composed. "And what do you suppose that signifies?" she asked. Mr. Harding met her gaze. "That someone altered them," he said. "Not recently, some time ago, but with purpose." There was a stillness then, not imposed, but inevitable. Miss Marple folded her hands. "One always wonders," she said, "what sort of purpose requires such careful attention over so long a time. It suggests not a momentary impulse, but a sustained intention." Mrs. Whitcomb's eyes rested on her. "Or a misunderstanding," she said. "One must allow for that." "Of course," Miss Marple replied. "One must allow for everything. Until one cannot." Clara felt a quiet realization forming. "If Mr. Pritchard discovered this," she said slowly, "then he would have known what it meant." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "And more importantly, who is concerned?" Mrs. Denby shifted in her seat. "You don't mean—" she began, then stopped. "No," Miss Marple said gently. "I do not mean anything at all. I'm merely observing that knowledge, once acquired, has a tendency to make itself known." Clara looked at Mrs. Whitcomb. She stood beside the table, her posture unchanged, her expression serene, yet there was something beneath it now, something Clara could not quite name, but could not ignore. Fear, not the obvious kind, not the kind that showed itself openly, but the quiet, contained fear of someone who had already considered what might happen, and was waiting to see whether it would. Miss Marple rose. "My dear Mrs. Whitcomb," she said, "you pour tea with such admirable care. It is quite a gift." Mrs. Whitcomb inclined her head. "One does what one can," she said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "and one does it very well." She paused, then added almost lightly, "Though I have noticed that you never drink your own." The room did not react, not outwardly, but Clara felt it, like a shift in pressure, subtle and unmistakable. Mrs. Whitcomb's hand rested on the table. "For the moment," she said calmly, "I find myself otherwise occupied." Miss Marple smiled. "Of course," she said. "One would not wish to be distracted." Clara's thoughts moved quickly now. The tea, the untouched cups, the careful pouring. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low, "do you think—" Miss Marple touched her sleeve lightly. "My dear," she said, "I think that when a person takes such care over what others consume, and none at all over their own, it is not a habit. It is a decision." Clara felt a sudden, sharp clarity, and with it, a question she was not certain she wished to ask. Across the room, Mrs. Whitcomb lifted the teapot once more. Her movements were as precise as ever. Her expression was gentle, but her eyes had not settled. And Clara, watching her, understood that whatever had been hidden in the records was not merely a matter of ink and paper. It was something living, something that had been protected, and something that, at last, was beginning to be seen. What the garden knew. The path behind the reading room was not meant for lingering. It was narrow and uneven. It was laid with stones that had settled into the earth at different depths, so that one walked it with care or not at all. Moss grew thick between them, softening the edges but not the difficulty. At the end stood the yew tree, its branches bending slightly toward the building as though it had, over many years, leaned in to listen. Clara had not intended to go there, yet after the morning's conversation, the closeness of the reading room, the measured voices, the careful hands, the sense that everything said had been weighed before it was spoken, had pressed upon her until she found herself stepping out through the vestry door without quite deciding to do so. The air was cooler in the garden, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and something sharper beneath it. Yew, perhaps, or the crushed leaves along the path. It felt, Clara thought, like a place that had not been arranged for comfort. Miss Marple was already there. She stood near the tree, her hands lightly clasped, her attention given not to Clara but to the ground beneath her feet. "My dear," she said without turning, "one often finds that the back of a place tells a different story from the front. It is where things are done without quite being meant to be seen." Clara stepped closer. "I needed air," she said. "It felt close inside." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Rooms can become so when people begin to think carefully. It is a very constricting process." She bent slightly, touching the edge of one of the stones. "You see how the path dips here," she said. "It suggests repeated use, though not by many feet. A particular habit rather than a general one." Clara followed her gaze. The stones near the door were worn evenly, as one would expect, but further along the wear became uneven, deeper on one side, as though someone had walked there often, alone, and always in the same way. "Who would come out here?" Clara asked. "Someone who wished to be unobserved," Miss Marple said, "or someone who wished to observe without being seen." Clara felt a small shiver, though the air was not cold. "You think this is connected?" she asked. Miss Marple straightened. "My dear, everything is connected. The difficulty lies in seeing how." She moved toward the yew tree. Its trunk was thick, the bark rough and dark, the branches dense enough to cast a shadow that remained even in the shifting light. "Yew trees are very interesting," Miss Marple said. "They live a long time. They outlast generations. And they are often planted near churches, which suggests a certain familiarity with what is kept and what is buried." Clara glanced at the ground beneath it. The earth there was uneven, though not freshly disturbed. There were small depressions, as though something had been placed there and later removed. "Do you see this?" Miss Marple asked, pointing with her umbrella. Clara knelt slightly. "Yes," she said. "It looks as though something has been set down repeatedly." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, "and not very long ago." Clara felt her thoughts quicken. "Could it be related to the records?" she asked. "Someone bringing them out here?" Miss Marple considered. "It is possible," she said, "though one must always ask why a person would choose such a place for that purpose. Records are usually altered in comfort, not in damp corners." Clara stood. "Then what would be done here?" Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly toward the reading room door. "My dear," she said, "when a person wishes to ensure that something is not seen, they often choose a place that is already overlooked. It is not secrecy that protects them, but familiarity." Clara followed her gaze. From the garden, the reading room windows appeared dark, the glass clouded by age and candle smoke. It would be difficult to see clearly inside from here. "And from inside," Clara said. "No one would notice someone out here." "Precisely," Miss Marple replied. There was a moment of quiet. Then Clara spoke, her voice low. "The tea," she said. "Mrs. Whitcomb pours it every time, and she never drinks it." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. And yesterday," Clara continued, "Mr. Pritchard drank his. As he always does, I imagine." "Yes." Clara felt the thought forming, though she resisted it. "You think," Miss Marple turned to her, "my dear, I think that when a person is responsible for what others consume, and takes great care in doing so, It is not unreasonable to consider what that care might involve. Clara's breath caught slightly. But why? She asked. If she is the one who altered the records, if she feared he would reveal it, why not simply stop him in some other way? Miss Marple's expression softened. Because, she said gently, people rarely think in such direct terms. They act according to what feels possible, and what feels possible is shaped by what they have done before. Clara frowned. I don't understand. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I once knew a woman in St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Larkins, who had a habit of adjusting small details in her household accounts. Nothing dramatic. A figure here, a date there. It began quite innocently, as such things often do, but over time she found herself unable to stop, not because she wished to deceive, but because she had grown accustomed to the act of adjustment itself. When a larger difficulty arose, she did not think to confront it directly. She simply altered it, as she had altered everything else. Clara felt a slow realization. You mean Mrs. Whitcomb didn't begin with something serious, she said. She began with small changes, and then, Miss Marple finished, the habit was already formed. Clara looked back at the ground beneath the yew tree. And this? She asked. What does this tell us? Miss Marple was silent for a moment. Then she said, it tells us that whatever has been done here was done repeatedly, with care, and with the expectation that it would not be noticed. Clara's gaze moved again to the reading room. And now it is being noticed, she said. Yes, Miss Marple replied, and that changes everything. There was a sound behind them. The door from the vestry opened. Mrs. Whitcomb stepped out into the garden. She paused when she saw them, though only for a moment. I wondered where you had gone, she said, her voice as gentle as ever. It is not a place many people choose to visit. It is very quiet, Clara said. Yes, Mrs. Whitcomb replied. That is its purpose. Her eyes moved to the ground near the tree, then back again. Were you looking for something? She asked. Miss Marple smiled. My dear Mrs. Whitcomb, one is always looking for something. It is simply that one does not always know what it is until one finds it. Mrs. Whitcomb held her gaze. And have you found it? She asked. Miss Marple's expression remained mild. Not yet, she said, but I believe I am beginning to understand where to look. Mrs. Whitcomb inclined her head. That is something, she said. There was a pause, not empty, but full of unspoken awareness. Clara felt it again, that quiet, insistent pressure, as though the truth were moving closer, not through discovery, but through recognition. Mrs. Whitcomb turned toward the door. We should go back inside, she said. It will be time for tea again soon. Clara glanced at Miss Marple. Tea. The word seemed to settle differently now. Miss Marple followed Mrs. Whitcomb without comment. As Clara stepped back onto the uneven path, she looked once more at the ground beneath the yew tree. The marks were still there, small, repeated, careful. Not the marks of something done once, but of something done again and again, until it no longer felt like an action at all, only a habit. And habits, Clara thought, were far more difficult to stop than anyone ever imagined. The shape of a habit. It was in the repetition of small things that Clara began, at last, to understand the shape of what they were facing. The reading room had taken on an air of quiet occupation, no longer merely a place for gathering, but a space in which something was being worked through, though no one named it directly. People came and went with purpose. Mr. Harding returned with additional papers. Mr. Fenton consulted old ledgers with a seriousness that suggested discomfort rather than interest. Even Colonel Brace, who had little patience for documents, lingered longer than usual, as though reluctant to leave before some unspoken matter had resolved itself. And always, at the centre of it, Mrs. Whitcomb. She moved among them with the same gentle efficiency, her voice steady, her manner composed, yet Clara could not now look at her without seeing the pattern beneath the surface. It was not in anything she said, it was in what she did and did not do. The tea, always the tea. Clara watched as Mrs. Whitcomb poured. The movement was exact, measured. Each cup is filled to precisely the same level, each saucer aligned just so, sugar added or omitted without question, or as though the preferences of others had been memorized long ago and never altered. And then, the final cup, poured for herself, set aside, untouched. Miss Marple, seated beside Clara, appeared to be absorbed in the arrangement of her gloves. My dear, she said softly, you see how very consistent it is. That is always the most instructive thing. One might overlook an irregularity, but consistency, especially in the wrong place, has a way of insisting upon attention. Clara nodded. It is not accidental, she said. It cannot be. No, Miss Marple replied. Accidents do not repeat themselves with such precision. Clara's thoughts moved quickly now, fitting together pieces that had previously seemed separate. The records, she said. The alterations, the pattern. It is the same kind of behaviour. Yes, Miss Marple said. The same mind, yet expressed in different ways. Clara felt a quiet certainty forming. She has been doing this for years, she said. adjusting things. Small changes at first, dates, names, and then, when Mr. Pritchard discovered it, she stopped. Miss Marple looked at her. "Yes," she said, "when he discovered it." Clara's voice dropped. She could not allow him to speak. Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she reached for her cup and took a small, thoughtful sip. "My dear," she said, "one must be careful not to move too quickly from observation to conclusion. It is a very natural impulse, but not always a reliable one." Clara felt a flicker of frustration. "But everything points to it," she said. "The tea, the habit, the fear." "Ah," Miss Marple said gently, "fear is indeed present, but fear alone does not tell us what has been done." "Ah, only why it might have been done." Clara drew a breath, steadying herself. "Then what are we missing?" she asked. Miss Marple's gaze moved across the room. "What is always missing," she said. "The moment at which the habit becomes action." Clara frowned. "I don't understand." Miss Marple leaned slightly closer. "A habit," she said, "is something one does without thinking. An action, in this sense, is something one does because one has decided to do it. The two may look very similar, but they are not the same." Clara considered this. "You think she did not decide," she said slowly, "that she simply continued." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think that when a person has grown accustomed to altering small things, the step to altering a larger one does not always feel like a step at all." Clara's gaze returned to Mrs. Whitcomb. She was speaking now with Mrs. Denby, her tone gentle, her expression calm. There was nothing in her manner that suggested guilt, nothing that suggested anything at all, and yet Clara could not unsee it. The precision, the control, the absence. "Miss Marple," she said, "if she has been doing this for so long, if the records have been altered over years, why now? Why would Mr. Pritchard only just discover it?" Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward Mr. Harding, who was examining a ledger near the cabinet. "My dear," she said, "people notice what they are ready to notice. Mr. Pritchard may have seen the inconsistencies before, but not understood their significance. It is only when a pattern becomes undeniable that it demands attention." Clara nodded slowly. "And once he understood, he could not ignore it," Miss Marple finished. There was a movement at the door. Mrs. Kersey entered, her expression strained. "The doctor's asking for you," she said to Mr. Fenton. "Says there's been a change." The room stilled. Mr. Fenton rose at once. "What sort of change?" he asked. Mrs. Kersey shook her head. "I don't know. Only he said to come quickly." Mr. Fenton left without another word. Clara felt her pulse quicken. "Do you think," she began. Miss Marple stood. "I think," she said, "that we are approaching the point at which things must either become clearer or more confused. It is often one or the other." Clara rose as well. "And what do we do?" she asked. Miss Marple looked at her. "We observe," she said, "and we remember." Clara followed her gaze to Mrs. Whitcomb. She had not moved. She stood beside the table, her hand resting lightly on the teapot, her expression unchanged, but her eyes, they were fixed on the door through which Mr. Fenton had gone, waiting. Clara felt a sudden, sharp understanding. "She knows," she said quietly. "She knows what is happening." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said, "and she knows what it means." Clara's voice dropped further. "Then why doesn't she—" She stopped, because the answer came to her even as she spoke. Mrs. Whitcomb did not move because there was nothing she could do. Whatever had been set in motion, whatever had begun long before this moment, was no longer within her control. Miss Marple's voice was soft. "My dear, when a person has acted out of fear for a very long time, they often reach a point where fear no longer guides them. It simply remains." Clara looked at her. "And what remains after that?" she asked. Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. "Consequence," she said. The word settled into the room with quiet finality. Outside, the light had shifted, though no one had noticed when it happened. Inside, the pattern, so carefully maintained, so quietly sustained, had begun to reveal itself, not through confession, not through accusation, but through the simple, undeniable weight of what had always been there, waiting to be seen. What was already there. The change, when it came, did not announce itself with drama. Mr. Fenton returned from Mr. Pritchard's house not in haste, but with a kind of careful slowness that drew attention far more surely than any urgency might have done. His face had altered. Not with shock, there had been time for that to pass, but with the weight of something settled, something no longer uncertain. "He is conscious," he said, standing just inside the reading room door. "Not fully, but enough to—" respond. No one spoke at once. Mrs. Denby's hand moved instinctively to her throat. Colonel Brace straightened, as though preparing for a statement that required endurance rather than reaction. Mr. Harding closed the ledger he had been examining with quiet precision, and Mrs. Whitcomb, she did not move. "Can he speak?" Clara asked. Mr. Fenton hesitated. "Not as such," he said. "The doctor believes the effort is too great, but he can indicate. Yes or no, perhaps." Recognition, certainly. Miss Marple inclined her head. That is often quite sufficient, she said. People are very clear when they are no longer concerned with how they are understood. Clara felt the truth of this settle into her. What did he respond to? She asked. Mr. Fenton looked at her, then at Miss Marple as though uncertain where to direct the answer. To names, he said at last, and to certain questions about the records. The room seemed to draw in slightly. And, Colonel Brace prompted, Mr. Fenton took a breath. He confirmed that he believed the records had been altered, that the discrepancies were deliberate, and that he intended to present his findings to the Parish Council this Sunday. Mrs. Denby gave a small, involuntary sound. But that is, she began, then stopped. Yes, Mr. Fenton said quietly. It would have been significant. Clara's thoughts moved quickly. He was trying to tell us, she said, in the reading room, yesterday. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. He was. Mr. Harding stepped forward. Did he indicate who was responsible? He asked. Mr. Fenton's gaze shifted. He attempted to, he said. The doctor asked him directly. He became agitated. I tried to form a word, but it was not clear. Clara felt a flicker of frustration. So we are no further forward, she said. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her. My dear, we are considerably further forward. We now know that Mr. Pritchard's suspicions were not only formed, but confirmed. That is a great deal. Clara nodded slowly. Yes, but without a name. Names, Miss Marple said gently, are often the last thing to become clear. One must first understand the shape of what has been done. Clara looked at her. And do you? She asked. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she rose and walked slowly toward the cabinet. The key lay where it had been left. She did not pick it up. Mr. Fenton, she said, you mentioned that Mr. Pritchard responded to certain questions. May I ask, did he respond to anything else? Anything not directly asked? Mr. Fenton considered. There was one moment, he said. The doctor mentioned the reading room again. He seemed to react more strongly then, as though it mattered particularly. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, she said, that would be the place. Clara felt a sudden clarity. The tea, she said, it happened there. It must have. Colonel Brace frowned. What do you mean? Clara turned to him. Mrs. Whitcomb pours the tea every time, she said. She knows everyone's preferences. She controls what they drink. There was a shift in the room, not yet an accusation, but the beginning of recognition. Mrs. Denby looked toward Mrs. Whitcomb, then quickly away. That is quite true, she said, but it is only a kindness. She has always done so. Miss Marple's voice was mild. Yes, she said. Kindness can take many forms. Clara's gaze moved to Mrs. Whitcomb. She stood as before, her hand resting lightly on the table, her expression composed. Too composed. Mrs. Whitcomb, Clara said, her voice careful, did you prepare the tea yesterday? Mrs. Whitcomb met her gaze. Yes, she said, as I always do. And Mr. Pritchard drank it? Yes. Clara felt her heart quicken. And you did not? There was a pause. Not long, but sufficient. I did not, Mrs. Whitcomb said. Miss Marple stepped forward. My dear Mrs. Whitcomb, she said gently, you pour tea with such admirable care. It is quite remarkable how consistent you are. Mrs. Whitcomb inclined her head. I believe in doing things properly, she said. Yes, Miss Marple replied, and in doing them the same way each time. There was a quiet stillness now. The room seemed to hold its breath, not in anticipation, but in recognition. Clara felt it, the pattern, the habit, the careful, repeated act. Miss Marple's voice remained soft. You see, she said, addressing no one in particular, when a person performs an action in exactly the same way, over and over again, it becomes invisible. No one questions it. No one looks closely. It is simply accepted. Clara nodded. Yes, she said, and that is how it could happen. Colonel Brace looked from one to the other. Are you suggesting? He began, then stopped. Miss Marple turned to him. I am suggesting nothing, she said. I am only observing what is already there. Her gaze moved, gently but unmistakably, to Mrs. Whitcomb. And what is there, she continued, is a pattern, a habit, a series of small, careful actions that, taken together, form something rather more significant than any one of them alone. Mrs. Whitcomb's expression did not change, but Clara saw it now. Not fear, not exactly, something quieter, acceptance. You believe, Mrs. Whitcomb said, her voice steady, that I have done something. Miss Marple looked at her. My dear, she said, I believe that you have been doing something for a very long time. There was no accusation in her tone, no confrontation, only the quiet placing of a truth where it could no longer be avoided. Clara felt the moment settle, not as a revelation, but as a recognition. Everything had been there, from the beginning. The tea, the records, the habit, the fear, all of it, not hidden, simply unacknowledged. Mrs. Whitcomb's hand moved slightly, then stilled. You must understand, she said, her voice still calm, that not everything is as it appears. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, she said, that is very often the case. Clara felt a strange stillness within herself, as though the question she had been forming had already been answered, not in words, but in the quiet, undeniable presence of what had always been there. And as she looked at Mrs. Whitcomb, she understood that whatever came next would not be a matter of discovery, only acknowledgement, because the truth, the real truth, had never been concealed, only overlooked, the thing that was meant to be forgotten. It was Miss Marple who suggested very gently that they should sit down, not because anyone had asked for it, nor because the moment demanded formality, but because, as she later remarked to Clara, people are much more likely to hear what is difficult when they are comfortably arranged. Standing encourages resistance. So they sat. Colonel Brace lowered himself into a chair with an air of reluctant duty. Mrs. Denby perched at the edge of hers, her hands clasped too tightly to be at ease. Mr. Harding remained near the desk, though he did not touch the papers again. Mr. Fenton stood for a moment longer, then sat as well, as though accepting something he had not wished to accept. And Mrs. Whitcomb, she did not sit at once. She stood beside the table, her hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, her gaze moving across the room as though taking in each person individually. Not in appeal, not in defence, in recognition. Miss Marple waited. She did not hurry the moment. She did not fill the silence. She allowed it to settle, to become something shared rather than avoided. At last, Mrs. Whitcomb sat. It was a small movement, almost unnoticeable, yet Clara felt with sudden clarity that something had shifted. "My dear Mrs. Whitcomb," Miss Marple said softly, "there is a great deal here that has been done very carefully. One cannot help but admire the consistency of it." Mrs. Whitcomb's expression did not change. "Consistency," she said, "is often mistaken for intent." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "though in this case I think it would be more accurate to say that it has become indistinguishable from it." There was no challenge in her tone, only a quiet placing of words where they belonged. Clara felt the weight of it. Not accusation, understanding. Mrs. Whitcomb folded her hands in her lap. "You believe," she said, "that I altered the records." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, and that I poisoned Mr. Pritchard." There was the faintest hesitation, not in the room, but in the word itself, as though it carried more than it ought. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at Mrs. Whitcomb with that same gentle attention she had given to everything else. "My dear," she said at last, "I believe that Mr. Pritchard has been unwell for some time, that his condition did not arise suddenly, but gradually, and whatever caused it was administered in such a way that it appeared entirely natural." Clara felt her breath catch, though she had already understood it. The room did not react with shock. There was no sudden exclamation, no dramatic denial, only a quiet stillness. Mrs. Whitcomb's gaze lowered briefly, then lifted again. "And you believe I did this?" she said. Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "I believe," she said, "that you did not begin with that intention." Clara saw it then, the smallest change, not in Mrs. Whitcomb's expression, but in her stillness, as though something within her had been acknowledged, not by accusation, but by recognition. Miss Marple continued. "You began," she said, "with something much smaller, a correction, a detail that did not seem quite right, a date perhaps, or a name, something that could be adjusted without consequence." Mrs. Whitcomb did not speak, but she did not look away. "And then," Miss Marple said, "there was another, and another, each one justified by the same reasoning, each one small enough to feel harmless." Clara thought of the records, the slight discrepancies, the careful adjustments. "It became a habit," she said quietly. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and habits, once formed, have a way of continuing, not because one wishes them to, but because they have become part of how one thinks." Mrs. Whitcomb's hands tightened slightly. "You make it sound inevitable," she said. "Not inevitable," Miss Marple replied, "but understandable." There was a pause. "Not empty, full." "And the records?" Mr. Harding asked, his voice low. "What was altered?" Miss Marple turned to him. "Entries connected to the Fairchild family," she said, "and others linked to them over time. Small changes that, taken individually, might be overlooked. But together, they form a pattern." "A pattern of what?" Colonel Brace asked. Miss Marple's gaze returned to Mrs. Whitcomb. "A pattern of concealment," she said. Clara felt the word settle. Not harsh, not dramatic, simply accurate. Mrs. Whitcomb drew a slow breath. "It was a long time ago," she said. "Long before any of you came here, before the reading room was what it is now, before people remembered things in the way they do now." Her voice was steady, but beneath it something else. Clara could not name it at once. Miss Marple waited. "Something happened," Mrs. Whitcomb said. "Something that was not meant to be known, not because it was wicked, but because it would have changed everything, for people who had already lost enough." Clara leaned forward slightly. "What sort of thing?" she asked. Mrs. Whitcomb looked at her. "An error," she said, "in a record. A birth recorded where it should not have been. A connection that, if seen, would have altered how certain people were regarded, how they regarded themselves. Clara felt a flicker of understanding. You changed it, she said, to protect them. Yes, Mrs. Whitcomb said. The word was quiet, but it carried. Miss Marple nodded. And afterward, she said, you continued. Not always for the same reason. Sometimes simply because it was easier than allowing the truth to stand. Mrs. Whitcomb's gaze dropped to her hands. Yes. Clara felt a strange tightening in her chest. It was not anger, not quite. Something closer to sorrow. And Mr. Pritchard discovered it, she said. Yes. Mrs. Whitcomb's voice was softer now. He saw what others had not. Not at first. But once he began, he could not stop. That was his nature. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes. He was a man who believed that what was written must be correct. That order, once disturbed, ye must be restored. Mrs. Whitcomb looked up. And he would have told them, she said. All of them. Not out of cruelty, simply because he believed it was right. There was no bitterness in her tone, only certainty. Clara felt the weight of it. And you could not allow that, she said. Mrs. Whitcomb did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached for the teapot. Her hand rested on it. Still. I did not think of it in those terms, she said at last. I did not think of it at all at first. Only that he was unwell, that he seemed tired, that a small adjustment might help. Clara closed her eyes briefly. The habit, the pattern, the same action, repeated. And then, she said, you continued. Yes. Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. My dear Mrs. Whitcomb, she said, you did not set out to harm him. But you had grown so accustomed to altering what was before you that, when faced with something you feared, you did not think to stop. You only thought about adjusting. Mrs. Whitcomb's eyes filled, though no tears fell. Yes, she said. The room remained still. No one spoke. There was nothing left to ask, only to understand. Miss Marple folded her hands. You see, she said softly, it is not always wickedness that leads to such things. Often, it is the desire to preserve what one believes to be good. That is what makes it so difficult. Clara felt the truth of it settle within her, not as judgment, as recognition. Mrs. Whitcomb looked at her. I did not mean, she began, then stopped. Clara met her gaze. I know, she said, and she did. Not in detail, not in justification, but in that quiet, human way that recognizes the distance between what is intended and what is done. Miss Marple rose. My dear, she said, there is nothing more to be said here. The rest will follow, as it must. Mrs. Whitcomb nodded. Yes, she said, and for the first time her voice was no longer entirely steady, because what had been done, carefully, quietly, over years, had at last been spoken, not as an accusation, but it's true, and once spoken, it could no longer be adjusted. What people will accept. No one suggested calling the police. Clara would later think this remarkable, not because it was improper, but because it revealed something essential about the village. In cities, she imagined, such matters would be passed at once into official hands, translated into statements and procedures. Here, the truth had been spoken in a room that knew it already. To summon outsiders would not clarify it. It would only change its shape. Mr. Fenton was the one who spoke first, though not immediately. He had risen from his chair after Miss Marple's quiet conclusion and gone to the window where he stood looking out, not at anything in particular, Clara thought, but at the idea of outside itself, as though it might offer a simpler arrangement than the one behind him. There are obligations, he said at last, his voice careful, practical ones, if what has been said is to be understood properly. Mrs. Whitcomb did not look at him. Yes, she said, there are. Her hands rested in her lap, no longer folded but open, as though she had set something down and did not intend to take it up again. Colonel Brace shifted in his seat. Well, this is all very, he began, then stopped. Very difficult, but surely the matter is not as grave as it sounds. The man is not dead. There has been no final consequence. Clara felt a small, involuntary reaction to that, though she did not speak. Miss Marple did. My dear Colonel, she said gently, consequences do not always wait for endings. They often begin much earlier, and in ways that are not immediately visible. Colonel Brace cleared his throat. Yes, well, I only meant one must consider proportion. There is a difference between an unfortunate error and a deliberate act. Mrs. Whitcomb lifted her head slightly. There is, she said, though it is not always where one expects to find it. Mr. Harding, who had remained near the desk, spoke then. The records, he said. They will need to be corrected. That is beyond question. Or whatever has been altered must be restored. His tone was not unkind, but it was firm. Mrs. Whitcomb nodded. Yes, she said, of course. And Mr. Pritchard's condition, Mr. Harding continued, will require explanation. If the doctor cannot account for it naturally, there will be inquiries. Clara watched Mrs. Whitcomb carefully. She did not flinch. She did not protest. She simply listened. Miss Marple folded her hands. "My dear Mr. Harding," she said, "you are quite right. There will be explanations. There always are. The question is not whether they will be given, but how they will be received." Mr. Harding frowned slightly. "I'm not sure I follow." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "In villages," she said, "people do not merely hear explanations. They weigh them, not always consciously, but very thoroughly. They consider what is said and what is not said, and what it would mean to accept one version of events rather than another." Clara felt a quiet shift in her understanding. "You mean," she said slowly, "that the truth is not the only thing that matters?" Miss Marple looked at her. "My dear, the truth always matters, but what people are willing to do with it, that is another question entirely." There was silence then, not uncomfortable, not uncertain, simply present. Mrs. Denby spoke at last, her voice low. "It was a long time ago," she said. "Whatever began this, and if it was done to protect someone—" She stopped, as though aware she had said more than she intended. Mrs. Whitcomb did not respond, but Clara saw the slight tightening of her hands. Mr. Fenton turned from the window. "We cannot pretend it did not happen," he said. "That would be wrong." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It would be. But neither," he continued, "can we ignore the circumstances, the intention, the context in which it occurred." Clara watched him carefully. "You mean to say," she said, "that it should be understood rather than judged?" Mr. Fenton met her gaze. "I mean to say that it must be both," he said, "though not necessarily in equal measure." Miss Marple inclined her head. "That is very well put," she said, "and very difficult to achieve." Mrs. Whitcomb looked at him. "You are kind," she said, "more than I deserve." Mr. Fenton shook his head. "This is not kindness," he said. "It is my responsibility, to the truth and to the people it affects." Clara felt the weight of that. The records, the names, the lives shaped by what had been written and what had been changed. "And Mr. Pritchard," she asked, "what happens when he wakes fully?" The question settled into the room. Miss Marple answered, "My dear, Mr. Pritchard has already done what he believed to be his duty. He has seen, he has understood, and he has attempted to speak. Whether he will continue to do so," she paused slightly, "will depend on what he finds when he returns to it." Clara frowned. "You think he may choose not to pursue it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think," she said, "that people who have spent their lives valuing order sometimes discover at the end that not all disorders can be corrected without cost, and that cost is not always borne by the person who insists upon the correction." Clara considered this. "And Mrs. Whitcomb?" she asked quietly. Miss Marple's gaze moved to her. "My dear Mrs. Whitcomb has already reached the point where the truth can no longer be adjusted. What remains is not a matter of concealment, but of consequence." Mrs. Whitcomb did not move. She sat as she had since Miss Marple spoke, still, composed, yet no longer holding anything in place. Clara felt a deep, quiet sadness, not for what has been done, but for the way it had come to be done, the small changes, the careful adjustments, the habit that had grown into something larger than itself. Miss Marple rose. "I think," she said gently, "that we have said what can be said here. The rest will follow, as it must." No one disagreed. There was nothing left to argue, nothing left to prove, only the slow unfolding of what had already been set in motion. As they began to gather their things, Clara looked once more at Mrs. Whitcomb. She was no longer arranging the room, no longer adjusting the details. She simply sat, and for the first time Clara understood that stillness could be more revealing than any action, because it showed what remained when everything else had been let go. Miss Marple moved toward the door. "My dear Miss Hastings," she said softly, "you will find that what people accept is often more telling than what they reject. It is not always the loud decisions that matter most." Clara nodded. "And what do you think they will accept?" she asked. Miss Marple paused, her hand resting lightly on the door. She considered the room, the people within it, the quiet weight of what had been spoken, the absence of anything left to conceal. Then she smiled, just slightly. "My dear," she said, "they will accept just enough." And with that she stepped outside, leaving behind a room in which the truth had been spoken, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that it could no longer be mistaken for anything else. Only for something that must now be lived with, the cup that remained. Clara did not attend the reading room the following Thursday. She told herself it was because her departure from Larkspur Hollow was imminent, and there were small practicalities to be managed, letters to write, trunks to close, a last walk to be taken along the lane where the hedges bent inward as though in quiet conversation. All of this was true, yet none of it was the reason she did not go. It was Miss Marple who suggested they walk instead. "My dear," she said that morning, adjusting her hat with that careful, almost absent-minded precision of hers, "one finds that after certain events, rooms become rather too full of what has been said. It is often better to allow them a little time to settle." So they walked. Not far, only as far as the low rise beyond the churchyard, where one could see the roofs of the village gathered together in a way that made them appear less separate than they felt from within. The yew tree behind the reading room was just visible from there. Clara looked at it. "I cannot think of it without remembering," she said. Miss Marple followed her gaze. "No," she said, "nor should you. Remembering is not the difficulty. It is what one does with the memory that matters." Clara considered this. "They have not spoken of it again," she said. "Not openly. I have heard nothing. It is as though it has been absorbed," Miss Marple finished gently. "Yes. That is often the way of such things in villages. They are not forgotten. They are accommodated." Clara frowned slightly. "And is that right?" she asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, right is a word that behaves very differently depending on where one places it. In St. Mary Mead there was once a gentleman, Mr. Lionel Bryce, who discovered that his sister had altered a letter to conceal a most inconvenient truth about their family. He was a very principled man, and determined to expose it at once. And he did, in fact. The result was not what he expected. The truth was acknowledged, certainly, but it did not restore what had been lost. It merely rearranged the discomfort." Clara listened. "And what happened to him?" she asked. Miss Marple's expression softened. "He spent many years believing he had done the right thing," she said, "and rather longer wondering whether it had been the kindest." They walked a little further in silence. The church bell rang once, not as a signal, but as a habit, something done because it had always been done. "And Mrs. Whitcomb?" Clara asked at last. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she bent slightly to adjust the strap of her glove, though it did not appear to need adjustment. "She remains," she said finally. "As one does." "That is all?" Clara asked, surprised. "My dear," Miss Marple said, straightening, "what more would you expect?" Clara hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted. "Something decisive." Miss Marple looked at her with gentle amusement. "Decisiveness is very satisfying in stories," she said. "In life, it is often less so. Mrs. Whitcomb has already reached the point where no further action will alter what has been done. What remains is not resolution, but continuation." Clara felt the quiet weight of that. "And Mr. Pritchard?" she asked. "He is improving," Miss Marple said. "Slowly. The doctor believes he will recover sufficiently to resume his ordinary habits, though perhaps not with quite the same vigour." "And will he—" Clara stopped, uncertain how to phrase it. "Will he still pursue the matter?" Miss Marple's gaze moved back toward the village. "My dear, Mr. Pritchard is a man who values order, but he is also a man who understands consequence. When he returns to his list, and he will find that it no longer holds quite the same urgency." Clara thought of the names, the careful marks, the intention behind them. "Because he knows," she said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "and because knowing is sometimes enough." They turned back toward the village. As they approached the reading room, Clara slowed. "May we go in?" she asked. Miss Marple inclined her head. "If you wish." The room was empty, not abandoned, but resting. The chairs were neatly arranged. The books stood as they had before. The stove was unlit, though a faint warmth lingered in the air, as though it remembered its purpose even in stillness. And on the table there was a cup. Clara stepped closer. It was the blue-rimmed one, and beneath it the cream saucer with the green leaves, together again, set carefully, not by accident. She felt a small, unexpected tightening in her chest. "It has been put right," she said. Miss Marple stood beside her. "Yes," she said, "or at least, it has been arranged to appear so." Clara looked at her. "You don't think it is right?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear, I think it is as right as it is going to be." Clara's gaze returned to the cup. "And that is enough?" Miss Marple considered this. "It is what people can bear," she said. Clara traced the edge of the saucer lightly with her finger. It felt smooth, ordinary, as though it had always been this way, but she knew it had not. "Miss Marple," she said quietly, "do you think Mrs. Whitcomb regrets it?" Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. "I think," she said, "that she understands it, and that is not always the same thing." Clara nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "I see that." They stood there for a moment longer. Then Miss Marple turned toward the door. "My dear," she said, "one cannot remain in such rooms indefinitely. They are for moments, not for dwelling." Clara followed her. At the threshold she glanced back once more. The cup and saucer remained on the table, perfectly matched, perfectly placed, and entirely unchanged by the fact that they had once been otherwise. Outside, the light had softened. The village moved as it always had, quietly, steadily, carrying its past not as a burden, but as something woven into its present. Miss Marple paused beside her. "You know," she said, "I once knew a woman in St. Mary Mead, Miss Eliza Burrow, who kept a drawer full of broken things. Cups without handles, plates with cracks, spoons bent just slightly out of shape. She never threw them away. When I asked her why, she said it was because she preferred to remember them as they had been, rather than pretend they had never been otherwise." Clara smiled faintly. "That seems rather sad," she said. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, my dear," she said, "it is rather honest." They walked on, and behind them, in the quiet of the reading room, the cup remained, no longer mismatched, no longer questioned, and no longer capable of being anything other than what it had become. Not perfect, not restored, simply accepted.